What if I told you that a man discovered a mathematical constant so fundamental to nature that it appears in everything from the spiral of a nautilus shell to the growth of your bank account, from the decay of radioactive atoms to the shape of galaxies, and then used his final breath to have that discovery carved onto his tombstone? What if I told you this same man came from a family that was supposed to produce merchants and ministers, but instead produced the greatest dynasty of mathematical geniuses the world has ever seen? And what if I told you that his greatest discovery, the number that now bears another man's name, was found through an obsession so intense it consumed his health, destroyed his relationship with his beloved brother, and ultimately killed him at just 50 years old? This is not legend. This is the story of Jacob Bernoulli, and it will leave you breathless. Welcome back to Numbers and Narratives by Bless Wright, where we don't just tell you the mathematics, we tell you the human stories behind the numbers, the passion, the obsession, the heartbreak that gave us the tools we use to understand our universe. I'm Bless Wright, and today's story is about a man who saw God in mathematics, who found infinity in a spiral, and who paid the ultimate price for his discoveries. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're about to take you on a journey through one of the most dramatic lives in the history of science. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you love learning about the forgotten geniuses who built our modern world, smash that like button. It helps us reach more people who need to hear these incredible tales. Now let's step back to 1655, to the city of Basel, Switzerland, where a family of spice merchants was about to produce something far more valuable than pepper and cinnamon. They were about to produce a legend. Basel, Switzerland, December 27, 1655. In a prosperous merchant's house, a boy is born into a family with very specific plans for his future. His name is Jacob Bernoulli, and from the moment he draws his first breath, his father Nicholas has already decided his son's entire life. Jacob will go into the family business. He will trade in spices, make respectable profits, marry well, produce heirs, and maintain the Bernoulli family's growing wealth and status. That is the plan. That is what is expected. That is what will happen. Except it doesn't, because from his earliest years, young Jacob shows absolutely no interest in commerce. None. While his father tries to teach him about trade routes and profit margins, Jacob's eyes glaze over, while Nicholas explains the intricacies of negotiating prices for pepper and cloves. Jacob's mind wanders to forbidden territories, to numbers, patterns, the hidden structures underlying reality itself. The boy is fascinated by mathematics and philosophy in a way that terrifies his practical, business-minded father. But here's what makes the Bernoulli family remarkable. Nicholas himself, despite being a spice merchant, was educated. He understood the value of learning, even if he wanted that learning channeled in respectable, profitable directions. So he allowed Jacob a classical education, hoping it would make him a more sophisticated merchant. What Nicholas didn't realize was that he was lighting a fuse. Once Jacob encountered Euclid, once he tasted the beauty of geometric proof, once he glimpsed the elegant structures of mathematical truth, there was no going back. The merchant's son had found his true calling, and it had nothing to do with spices. The conflict between father and son must have been agonizing. Imagine Nicholas, a self-made man who built his wealth through practical commerce, watching his eldest son, his heir, become obsessed with abstract nonsense that couldn't be sold or traded. Imagine Jacob, burning with intellectual passion, forced to pretend interest in business matters that seemed trivial compared to the profound questions that consumed him. The tension in that household must have been unbearable, and Nicholas tried a compromise. If Jacob wouldn't be a merchant, at least he could be respectable in another way. Theology, the church. That was an honorable profession, one that required education and brought prestige to the family. Reluctantly, Jacob agreed. In 1671, at age 16, he enrolled at the University of Basel to study philosophy and theology. It seemed like a reasonable compromise. Jacob would get his education, and Nicholas would get a son in a respectable profession. But Jacob Bernoulli had no intention of keeping this bargain. At the university officially studying theology, Jacob secretly devoured mathematics. He read Descartes, studied the new analytical geometry that was revolutionizing how mathematicians understood space and curves. He consumed everything he could find about the latest developments in mathematics and astronomy. And here's the beautiful irony. It was his theological studies that gave him the language to describe what he was really doing. Jacob didn't see mathematics as separate from spirituality. For him, mathematics was a form of worship, a way of glimpsing the mind of God through the perfect structures he had embedded in creation. In 1676, Jacob received his master's degree in theology. His father breathed a sigh of relief. His son was educated, credentialed, ready to take up a position in the church. But Jacob had other plans. Instead of seeking a church position, he left Basel. He traveled to Geneva, to France, to the Netherlands, to England. Officially, he was broadening his education. Actually, he was seeking out the greatest mathematical minds of the age, learning everything they could teach him, preparing himself for the life he truly wanted. During these travels, Jacob met scientists and mathematicians who were wrestling with the newest, most exciting development in mathematics: calculus. This revolutionary tool, being developed independently by Newton in England and Leibniz on the continent, promised to unlock the mathematics of change, motion, curves, and rates. It was exactly what Jacob had been searching for, a mathematical language powerful enough to describe the complexity of God's creation. He returned to Basel in 1682, and his father's worst nightmare came true. Jacob announced he would not be entering the church. Instead, he would teach mathematics. Nicholas was devastated. All those years of education, to all that investment, and his son was throwing away every opportunity for respectability and financial security to pursue mathematical abstractions that no one cared about and that generated no income. But Jacob was immovable. He began giving private mathematics lessons. He tutored whoever would hire him. The pay was minimal, the prestige non-existent. His father was ashamed. His relatives whispered that Jacob had wasted his life. But Jacob didn't care. For the first time, he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. And the joy of that was worth any sacrifice. And then in 1687, everything changed. The University of Basel created a chair in mathematics, and Jacob Bernoulli was appointed to fill it. At 32 years old, against his father's wishes, against every expectation of his family and social class, Jacob had achieved the impossible. He was now professor of mathematics at the University of Basel. He had a salary, a position, respect, and most importantly, he had the time and resources to pursue the mathematical questions that obsessed him. The first thing Jacob did was systematic. He set out to master calculus completely. Remember, this was cutting-edge mathematics. Newton's Principia had just been published that same year, 1687. Leibniz's papers on calculus were still appearing in journals. This wasn't material you could find in textbooks. There were no textbooks. You had to work directly from research papers, filling in gaps, correcting errors, extending methods. It was brutally difficult work. Jacob threw himself into it with ferocious intensity. He studied Leibniz's papers obsessively. He worked through every problem, every technique, every application. And as he worked, he began to see possibilities that even Leibniz hadn't fully explored. He began to push calculus in new directions, to ask new questions, to develop new methods. One of his earliest breakthroughs concerned curves. Mathematicians had always been fascinated by curves: circles, ellipses, parabolas, spirals. But with calculus, you could ask new questions about curves. What is the length of this curve? What is the area under it? What curve connects 2 points in the shortest possible way? Jacob became obsessed with these questions, and his work laid the foundations for what would become the calculus of variations, the mathematics of finding optimal curves and shapes. But then something happened that would transform Jacob's life, multiply his productivity, and ultimately break his heart. His younger brother Johann came to study mathematics with him. Johann Bernoulli was 12 years younger than Jacob, born in 1667. Like Jacob, Johann had been pushed toward a respectable profession, in his case, medicine. Like Jacob, Johann had absolutely no interest in his assigned profession, and like Jacob, Johann was a mathematical genius. When Johann arrived at the University of Basel and began studying with his older brother, the intellectual chemistry was explosive. Finally, Jacob had a collaborator who could match him, who could understand his ideas, who could push back and challenge him. The brothers worked together, and for a few precious years, it was glorious. They tackled the hardest problems in the new calculus. They competed to solve challenges posed by other mathematicians. They pushed each other to greater and greater achievements. Jacob was the more systematic, careful, rigorous thinker. Johann was quicker, flashier, more intuitive. Together, they were unstoppable. They worked on the catenary, the shape a hanging chain makes, and found the exact mathematical curve it describes. They explored the Brachistochrone problem. What curve would allow a ball to roll from one point to another in the shortest time? And found solutions that astonished the mathematical world. They developed new techniques, new applications, new theoretical frameworks. The Bernoulli brothers were becoming famous throughout Europe as the masters of the new calculus. But underneath the collaboration, tension was building. Johann was brilliant, perhaps even quicker than Jacob, and he knew it. Jacob was the established professor. Yes, the older brother, the authority figure, and he expected deference. Johann chafed under Jacob's authority. Jacob grew irritated by Johann's arrogance. Each brother's successes became threats to the other's pride. The breaking point came over a curve. A simple curve, really. Just a spiral. But this spiral would destroy their relationship and become Jacob Bernoulli's obsession for the rest of his life. It's called the logarithmic spiral, and if you've ever seen a nautilus shell, you've seen this curve. It's a spiral that grows exponentially as it curves outward, maintaining the same shape at every scale. Jacob discovered something remarkable about this spiral. No matter how you transform it mathematically, stretch it, shrink it, rotate it, reflect it, it remains the same spiral. It's invariant under certain transformations. It returns to itself eternally. Jacob became absolutely obsessed with this spiral. He saw in it something profound, something almost mystical. Here was a mathematical object that embodied constancy within change, eternal sameness within endless transformation. It was, he believed, a perfect metaphor for resurrection. The human body changes, dies, decays, but the soul remains constant, returning in eternal form. Jacob wrote that the spiral should be engraved on his tomb with the Latin phrase, idem mutata resurgo. Although changed, I arise the same. But while Jacob was having mystical revelations about spirals, Johann was making his own discoveries, and he wasn't always giving Jacob credit. In fact, Johann was beginning to claim that he had made certain discoveries first, that Jacob's work built on his insights, that he was actually the more important mathematician of the two brothers. Jacob was furious. How dare his younger brother, whom he had trained, whom he had mentored, try to claim priority over him? How dare Johann suggest that the student had surpassed the master? The arguments became bitter. Letters between them turned hostile. Other mathematicians began taking sides. The mathematical community of Europe watched in dismay as the Bernoulli brothers, who had been such powerful collaborators, tore each other apart over questions of credit and priority. The tragedy is that both brothers were genuinely brilliant. Both made real important contributions, but ego, pride, family dynamics, and the brutal competitive culture of mathematics in that era turned their relationship toxic. By the late 1690s, Jacob and Johann were barely speaking. They published papers attacking each other. They accused each other of errors, of plagiarism, of mathematical incompetence. It was ugly, petty, and heartbreaking. And through all this personal turmoil, Jacob kept working. Because whatever else was happening in his life, whatever conflicts were destroying his family relationships, the mathematics remained pure. The mathematics was still beautiful. The mathematics was still his path to understanding God's creation. It was during this period of isolation and conflict that Jacob made perhaps his greatest discovery, though even this wouldn't bear his name. He was working on problems in probability, a relatively new area of mathematics that dealt with chance, uncertainty, gambling, and prediction. And he stumbled upon a number, a constant, that appeared again and again in different contexts, and the number was approximately 2.71828, and Jacob discovered it while studying compound interest. Here's the question he asked. What happens if you take one unit of currency and apply 100% interest, but instead of calculating the interest once per year, you calculate it more and more frequently? What if you compound twice per year? Monthly? Daily? Every second? Every instant? As the compounding frequency approaches infinity, what limit does the final amount approach? The answer Jacob found was this mysterious number, 2.71828. It's not a simple fraction. It's not a familiar number like pi. It's something new, something fundamental, and Jacob found it appearing in problem after problem. It showed up in his work on probability, in calculations involving growth and decay, in the mathematics of logarithms. And this number was clearly important, clearly fundamental to mathematics. But Jacob didn't name it. He documented it, he calculated it to several decimal places, he recognized its importance, but he didn't claim it or name it after himself. Years later, another mathematician, Leonhard Euler, would rediscover this constant, explore it more fully and name it E, possibly after his own name, possibly just because it was the next available letter after A, B, C, and D had been used for other constants. Today we call it Euler's number, and most people have no idea that Jacob Bernoulli discovered it first. This is one of the quiet tragedies of Jacob's life. The number E is one of the most important constants in all of mathematics. It's as fundamental as pi. It appears everywhere, in calculus, in probability, in statistics, in physics, and in engineering, in finance. Every time you calculate compound interest, every time you model population growth or radioactive decay, every time you solve a differential equation, you're using Jacob's discovery, but it carries another man's name. Did this bother Jacob? We don't know. His writings suggest he was less concerned with personal glory than with understanding the truth. But still, to make a discovery that fundamental and have history forget you made it first, that's brutal. Jacob's greatest work, the culmination of his research in probability, was a book called Ars Conjectandi, The Art of Conjecturing. In this book, Jacob laid out the foundations of probability theory in a systematic way that no one had done before. He proved what we now call the law of large numbers, the fundamental principle that as you repeat a random experiment more and more times, the observed frequencies approach the true probabilities. This might seem obvious now, but proving it rigorously was a tremendous achievement. The Ars Conjectandi also contained extensive work on combinatorics, the mathematics of counting and arranging. Jacob developed formulas for calculating combinations and permutations. He explored the mathematical structure of games of chance. He showed how probability could be applied to practical questions about insurance, annuities, and risk management. This book was going to be his masterpiece, his definitive contribution to mathematics. But Jacob never saw it published. By the early 1700s, Jacob's health was failing. The exact nature of his illness isn't clear from historical records. Possibly tuberculosis, possibly some other disease. What's clear is that he was exhausted. Years of intense intellectual work, years of conflict with his brother, years of pushing himself relentlessly to make discoveries and solve problems had taken their toll. His body was breaking down. He kept working on the Ars Conjectandi, trying to complete it, trying to get everything down on paper while he still could. But the work was vast and he was running out of time. Entries in his journal from this period show his awareness that death was approaching. He wrote with increasing urgency, trying to capture everything he'd learned, everything he wanted to pass on to future mathematicians. And he thought about his spiral, the logarithmic spiral that had obsessed him for years, that he'd explored mathematically in such depth, that represented to him the eternal return, the resurrection, the unchanging soul within the changing body. He gave instructions that this spiral should be carved on his tombstone, along with the phrase, idem mutata resurgo. On August 16, 1705, Jacob Bernoulli died in Basel at the age of 50. He was surrounded by family, but not by his brother Johann. Their relationship had never healed. His great work, the Ars Conjectandi, remained unfinished, unpublished, sitting in manuscript form. The funeral was respectable. The university honored him. He was buried in Basel Münster, the city's great cathedral, and on his tomb they carved the spiral, just as he'd requested. Idem mutata resurgo. Although changed, I arise the same. But here's where the story takes a bittersweet turn. The stonecutter who carved the tomb made a mistake. Instead of carving a logarithmic spiral, the specific mathematical curve Jacob had studied and loved. He carved an Archimedean spiral, a completely different curve with completely different properties. The Archimedean spiral doesn't have the self-similarity that made Jacob's spiral so special. It doesn't embody the eternal return he'd found so meaningful. Think about that. Jacob's final wish, his attempt to have his greatest intellectual love permanently commemorated, was botched by a workman who didn't understand the mathematics. The wrong spiral sits on Jacob Bernoulli's tomb to this day. It's such a perfectly tragic metaphor for his life. Brilliant insights that weren't always recognized. Fundamental discoveries attributed to others. Deep meanings lost in translation. The Ars Conjectandi sat unpublished for 8 years. Finally, in 1713, Jacob's nephew Nicholas Bernoulli, Johann's son ironically, edited it and arranged for publication. When it appeared, it was immediately recognized as a masterpiece. It became the foundation for probability theory. Mathematicians across Europe studied it, built on it, extended it. Jacob's work on the law of large numbers became a cornerstone of statistics. His combinatorial formulas became standard tools. His vision of probability as a rigorous mathematical subject became reality. But Jacob wasn't there to see it. He wasn't there to receive the accolades, to engage with critics, to continue developing his ideas. He died believing his masterwork might never be published, might never be read, might be lost forever. And his brother Johann? Johann lived until 1748, 43 years after Jacob's death. He became one of the most famous mathematicians in Europe, professor at Basel in the chair that Jacob had once held. Johann trained the next generation of mathematical geniuses, including Leonhard Euler, who would become perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 18th century. Johann received honors, acclaim, positions. He watched his own sons become mathematicians, continuing the Bernoulli dynasty. But he never reconciled with Jacob. There's no record of Johann ever publicly acknowledging the depth of his debt to his older brother or expressing regret for their conflict. The bitterness apparently lasted Johann's entire life. When the history of mathematics is written, Johann Bernoulli's name appears prominently, often more prominently than Jacob's. The younger brother, in the end, won the fame that had been such a bitter point of contention between them. Is this fair? Of course not. Jacob was every bit as brilliant as Johann, and in some ways more rigorous, more careful, more profound. But history is written by the survivors, and Johann survived to shape the narrative. Yet here's what Jacob would probably say if he could speak to us now. The mathematics matters more than the names. The truth matters more than the credit. Jacob believed he was uncovering God's design, reading the divine blueprint of creation. Whether people remembered Jacob Bernoulli's name was less important than whether the truths he discovered remained available for future generations. And they have. Every time a statistician uses the law of large numbers, Jacob's insight lives. Every time an engineer uses E in calculations, Jacob's discovery matters. Every time a mathematician works on calculus of variations, they're building on Jacob's foundations. Every time someone studies probability, they're walking paths Jacob cleared. The Bernoulli family, incidentally, produced at least 8 significant mathematicians across 3 generations. It's the most remarkable mathematical dynasty in history. Jacob started it. His brother Johann extended it. Their descendants kept it going. The Bernoulli name became synonymous with mathematical excellence. Jacob never knew he was founding a dynasty, but he was. And that spiral on his tomb, even though it's the wrong spiral, still testifies to something profound. It testifies to a man who saw mathematics as a path to the eternal, who found spiritual meaning in curves and numbers, who believed that the patterns governing nature were worthy of worship. Jacob Bernoulli was a man of deep faith who never saw a contradiction between his Christian beliefs and his mathematical work. For him, they were unified. Both were ways of approaching divine truth. His phrase, eadem mutata resurgo, carries layers of meaning beyond just the mathematical properties of the spiral. It's a statement of faith in resurrection, yes, but it's also a statement about mathematical truth itself. Truths that remain constant even as they're transformed, expressed differently, approached from new angles. It's a statement about the human desire for something permanent in a changing world. And it's a statement about Jacob himself, a man who changed throughout his life, who evolved from reluctant theology student to mathematical pioneer, but who remained essentially himself, driven by the same fundamental questions about order, pattern, meaning, and truth. There's a modern epilogue to Jacob's story that he could never have imagined. The number E, which he discovered, has become absolutely central to modern technology. Every smartphone, every computer, every digital device relies on mathematics involving E. The exponential function e raised to a power is crucial for everything from data compression to cryptography to machine learning algorithms. When your phone recognizes your face, when Netflix recommends a movie, when your GPS finds the fastest route, and the mathematics involved traces back through centuries to include Jacob's discovery. The probability theory Jacob pioneered is now the foundation of statistics, which in turn is the foundation of data science, artificial intelligence, medical research, economics, social science, virtually every field that deals with uncertainty and prediction. Insurance companies, which Jacob specifically discussed in Ars Conjectandi, use probability theory that builds directly on his work. Financial models, epidemiology, quality control, polling, clinical trials, all rely on principles Jacob helped establish. The calculus of variations that Jacob pioneered is now used in physics, engineering, economics, and computer graphics. When physicists calculate the path of least action, when engineers design the strongest structure for minimal weight, and then when economists model optimal resource allocation, when animators create realistic motion, they're using mathematical tools that descend from Jacob's work. Jacob Bernoulli, the merchant's son who was supposed to trade in spices, ended up giving humanity tools far more valuable than any commodity. He gave us mathematical frameworks for understanding chance, change, optimization, and growth. He gave us E, even if we call it by another man's name. He gave us systematic probability theory. He gave us the beginnings of the calculus of variations. And he gave us something else, an example of intellectual courage. Jacob defied his father's expectations, his family's pressure, his society's norms to pursue what he knew was his calling. He chose poverty and obscurity over wealth and respectability because he couldn't deny the mathematical passion that consumed him. He paid the price: professional struggle, family conflict, health deterioration, early death. But he never compromised. He never gave up the work that mattered to him. That's heroic. Not the flashy heroism of battlefield courage, but the quiet, stubborn heroism of staying true to your calling even when everything and everyone tells you to quit, to be practical, to give up on your dreams. Jacob Bernoulli spent his entire adult life fighting for the right to do the work he was born to do. And he won that fight, even if the victory cost him dearly. The tragedy of his broken relationship with Johann remains painful. These were two brilliant brothers who should have been the greatest collaborators in mathematical history. Instead, they became bitter rivals who died estranged. The waste of that, the pointlessness of it, the purely human stupidity of letting pride and ego destroy love and partnership. It's heartbreaking. How much more could they have accomplished together? How much joy did they deny themselves? But perhaps even this tragedy teaches us something. It teaches us that genius doesn't automatically bring wisdom. Brilliance doesn't guarantee emotional maturity. You can understand the deepest mathematical truths and still be petty, prideful, and blind to what really matters. The Bernoulli brothers' feud is a warning. Guard your relationships because, in the end, the human connections matter more than the professional triumphs. Jacob died estranged from his brother, and all his mathematical achievements couldn't fill that void. Still, standing at Jacob's tomb today, seeing that spiral, even the wrong spiral, and reading those Latin words, you feel the power of his vision. Here was a man who believed mathematics could lead to God, who saw eternity in a curve, who trusted that beauty and truth were ultimately the same thing. Here was a man who chose the hard path because it was the true path, who sacrificed comfort for calling, who gave everything to advance human knowledge. We use his discoveries every day without knowing his name. That's both the triumph and the tragedy of Jacob Bernoulli's life. The triumph: his work was so fundamental that it's now invisible, built into the foundations of modern mathematics like stones in the foundation of a cathedral. You don't see them, but without them, the whole structure collapses. The tragedy: he's forgotten by the millions who benefit from his genius. But maybe Jacob would be okay with that. He believed in truth beyond ego, in meaning beyond fame. He carved that spiral on his tomb not as a monument to himself, but as a testament to the eternal patterns he glimpsed through mathematics. Although changed, Ars the same. It's not about Jacob Bernoulli the individual. It's about the truths that transcend individuals, the mathematical structures that remain constant while civilizations rise and fall, while names are remembered and forgotten. Jacob Bernoulli died at 50, far too young, his masterwork unfinished, his relationship with his brother destroyed, his greatest discovery destined to carry another man's name. By conventional measures, you might call his life tragic, incomplete, even failed. But 3 centuries later, we still use his mathematics. We still prove theorems he conjectured. We still teach ideas he pioneered. The spiral still curves on his tomb, pointing towards something beyond itself, beyond him, beyond any individual, pointing toward the eternal truths he spent his life pursuing. And maybe that's exactly the resurrection he hoped for. Not personal fame, not historical recognition, but the work living on, the truth enduring, the patterns he discovered continuing to illuminate reality for future generations who will never know they're walking in his footsteps. Jacob Bernoulli saw God in mathematics, eternity in a spiral, infinity in a constant. He paid everything to pursue that vision. And although changed by time and death and history's forgetfulness, his work arises again and again and again in every calculation, every probability, every insight that builds on the foundations he laid. Idem mutata resurgo. Although changed, I arise the same. That's not just Jacob's epitaph, it's his promise, it's his gift, it's his triumph over death itself, not through fame or remembrance, but through truth that outlasts all names and all forgetting. That's the story of Jacob Bernoulli, merchant son, rebellious student, mathematical pioneer, discoverer of father of probability theory, brother, believer, a man who saw infinity and tried to bring it down to earth for the rest of us to see. If this story moved you, and if it made you think about what we sacrifice for our callings, what we lose in our competitions, what survives us when we're gone, do me a favor, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about Jacob's courage, his vision, his refusal to compromise. Subscribe to Numbers and Narratives by Bless Right if you haven't already, because we're going to keep telling these stories. The forgotten geniuses, the hidden heroes, the mathematical pioneers whose work built our modern world. Ring that notification bell so you never miss another story. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you sacrifice to pursue your true calling? What mathematical constant amazes you most? Have you ever let pride destroy a relationship that mattered? Let's talk in the comments. And remember, the truths you discover, the work you do that matters, was the insights you share. They might outlive your name, but they'll never die. Like Jacob's spiral, they arise again and again and again. Until next time, keep seeking truth and never forget the human stories behind the numbers.